Thank you.
Okay, thank you, John. I'd just like to echo Shai's earlier comments. Great to be speaking to a live audience for a change rather than a computer screen. And hopefully we'll get some good questions and interaction once I get through my talk today, which, as has been said, is around the new secondary option X29, designed to tackle the issue of climate change. So what I'll cover today is briefly go through the consultation process, feedback received, then give an overview as to the reasons why we developed secondary option X29, then look at some of the key aspects of the option, and then conclude with next steps in the process. So secondary option X29 was issued initially as a consultative draft on the 4th of April, and that was to seek industry feedback in respect of the option before final publication. I think we're recognising that combating climate change is a developing, fast-changing issue, and we want to engage with potential users to understand what we'd got right, what we'd got wrong, and basically how it could be improved to better deliver the aims to help reduce the impact of works of the creation and use of assets in respect of climate change. So the secondary option was downloaded 250 times. Some of those downloads were by organisations who then shared it internally, so a reasonable engagement process. Of that, we had 40 responses, 40 formal responses, and many of those again were from organisations who'd consolidated their opinions and fed those through. I think we're hoping that the other 210 who didn't respond were happy with it, though in fairness we're still getting comments being received currently, and we are continuing to look at the responses received to see whether there's any sort of things we need to consider going forward. As you can imagine, there was a wide range of views expressed. The majority, I have to say, were supportive, did think the option was going to hopefully achieve its aims, but there was issues that needed to be addressed. So all of the feedback was reviewed, all of it was considered, and we sorted it into those issues that we felt didn't need to be specifically addressed. A lot of issues went into the topic of covered in guidance, further guidance on how the existing provisions in the contract operate, how they're linked into X29, and then there were changes that we recognised we needed to make, and that has led now to the production of a final version of X29 ready for publication. So the final version is actually very similar to the consultative edition. So it follows a similar structure, has the same key components within it. There are some changes made to terminology. The wording of certain clauses have been tweaked, have been revised. And in particular, we've changed clauses relating to the climate change plan. That was the climate change execution plan previously. We've done some work to sort of simplify it, to provide a greater focus over what that is intended to do. Quite a lot of the issues raised were things to be addressed within guidance, and so we've got an extended and enhanced set of guidance notes that will support the secondary options, covering a number of those topics that have been raised. So the intent now is to get a final version of secondary option X29 issued for use with all main contracts and all main subcontracts by the end of this month. And we're also considering how we could bring a simplified version of X29 into the short contracts. Obviously, we don't want to sort of overburden that. We've got to be mindful of the supply chain and some of these smaller players within that. But at the same time, this issue of climate change has to go throughout the supply chain for it to really take effect. So the presentation I'm giving now is based around the X29 for the NEC4 ECC, the engineering and construction contract, but the principles, the content will be the same in all of the versions of X29 in those main contracts and subcontracts. So, a bit of background as to why we started down this journey of producing secondary option X29. I don't think I need to labour this slide in much detail. I think we all recognise we're facing a climate change emergency. We've already heard around the fact that the built asset and the use of built assets is a major contributor to carbon usage, And if we want to move to net zero emissions of carbon dioxide and other climate warming gases, we need a step change in how we create, maintain and operate our buildings and infrastructure. So that led us to start to look at producing an option to address this issue. It's a key issue for public and private sector organisations, but it is worth saying that this is all part of a process of creating and operating assets, and the inclusion of a secondary option and somebody simply picking X29 doesn't mean we've sort of solved the issue and we can all think, yeah, done it, push it onto the supply chain to then deliver problems that have been maybe already created in the design, in the way the procurement process has already evolved. So we do need to consider climate change as a whole life issue and not simply something addressed in a single clause. X29 needs to be part of a larger step change in how we procure, maintain and operate assets. So in terms of how do we reduce the impact of the works on climate change, this is principally a technical issue and addressed within the scope. The scope specifies what under the ECC the contractor has to do, any constraints on how they do it. Surely we can simply include requirements in that will address the issue of climate change. Do we need to do something different? Bearing in mind the contractor has to comply with the scope. A failure to do so will be breach of their contract obligations, and in relation to the works themselves, a defect that will need to be corrected. However, we feel there's limitations in this approach, as it relies on users including the required content in the scope and also linking that through to the contractual processes in the contract. So processes for incentivising, for raising early warnings, those sorts of issues. Contracts are an enabler. Contracts are there to help deliver the client's objectives or contractor to subcontractor objectives for the asset, and that would include climate change targets. So with a contract therefore needs to address this issue and support, require, incentivise the delivery of these targets, these objectives. And so the view was that introducing additional conditions of contract is going to be beneficial, signposting the issues to be covered by the scope, raising their profile, making sure they are being addressed, incentivising performance against those climate change targets, objectives that have been set. And also, when we went through X29, we considered every clause in the existing contracts to see whether those clauses would support or hinder the reduction of climate change, which clauses we need to sort of take into X29 or refer to in X29 to make sure it joined up and it was going to drive the right behaviours. We wouldn't have any conflicting requirements within the contract. We did think about, do we use existing processes within the contracts? Do we need a specific secondary option? Are we making something more complex than it needed to be? There was discussions around using existing secondary options like X17 low performance damages along with X20 KPIs. But the view was that wouldn't fully address the issue. It wasn't going to give the right processes, the right procedures, and it wouldn't drive that step change needed to address the issue. And so we felt we needed to produce something specific, something separate, that was familiar and linked in with existing processes and procedures within the contract. So one of the first things we've done in X29 is introduce the concept of climate change requirements. These are stated in the scope, and therefore they're things the contractor has to achieve. And this could be requirements in terms of the finished works, so materials to be used, not to be used, outputs, things the finished works have to achieve, but also requirements for sort of green working practices. How do we, in providing the works, mitigate the impact on climate change? We saw the example earlier, HS2, battery powered cranes. Those sorts of initiatives could be included within the climate change requirements. So these are seen as sort of a minimum, a must achieve level, as a failure to do so will be breach of that obligation to provide the works in accordance with the scope. If that then results in a defect in the finished works, that would have to be corrected as a defect. But it's important to understand that a failure to provide the works in accordance with the scope is still a breach of an obligation, but that doesn't result in a defect to be corrected. Often it can't be because we've passed that stage when that activity took place. So we needed a way of addressing that, as well as making sure that the works themselves were performing to the required levels. So that led to a thought process to introduce a performance table to incentivize the contractor to achieve targeted levels of performance that may be in addition to the climate change requirements, sort of stretch targets. So a failure to achieve the performance level will be dealt with through financial motivation. So it can be incentivized positively or negatively. So a way of trying to hopefully improve performance. If you don't achieve it, there will be consequences, but we're not going to have a defect that needs to be replaced or rectified. And also, those performance targets can apply to how the works themselves are undertaken. So the use of electric vehicles, the use of certain levels of recycled materials. So things that can be targeted during the construction process as well as in the finished works. And whilst we expect people to want to include incentives within the performance table, these commercial incentives, the performance table could be used just to measure, just to record performance. Maybe for clients, users with less maturity may want to start by having a performance table simply to measure progress, but then you could move to financial incentivization. And one thing to bear in mind is that where there are financial incentives, positive and negative, limitations can be, and I suggest should be, placed on the extent to which the supplier, the contractor, subcontractor may have to contribute in terms of negative payments as a result of underperformance. We do need to make sure these targets are realistic and they don't become sort of a stick to beat the supply chain with. We need to encourage and engage and not try and push the issue further along the supply chain. The expectation is the climate change requirements and the performance table will commonly be developed by the client. So the client will set those out at tender stage, but there could be a process for allowing bidders to submit maybe enhancements, changes, and have that evaluated as part of the tender selection process. Depending on the procurement process you're using, maybe they can be developed collaboratively, but obviously we have to mind various rules, various processes we have to follow, particularly in public sector procurement. And if we do have a situation where bidders are making commitments in relation to the climate change requirements or performance table, we do need to make sure those are then captured in the final contract to make sure then people are being held to deliver the promises and commitments they've made. So I mentioned earlier that we have something called a climate change plan. This is slightly reworded from the consultative edition. This is produced by the contractor and sets out how the contractor intends to meet the climate change requirements and achieve the targets in the performance table. So it's sort of a statement of intent, some practical steps they're going to adopt to achieve these things. A climate change plan is either included in contract data part 2, so submitted by a bidder as part of the tender process, or it can be submitted after contract award. That's an option for the project manager to accept within a set period of time after the contract date. That climate change plan is then updated and reissued for acceptance as necessary. So at the instruction of the project manager or when the contractor chooses to do so. So the idea is to keep it relevant, to keep it updated as things change, perhaps compensation events, changes in scope, etc. Some other key aspects of the secondary option: collaboration. There's a requirement for the contractor to collaborate with other climate change partners identified in the climate change requirements. So that could be other contractors engaged by the client, subcontractors, consultants, the client themselves. We also have a requirement for early warnings to be notified for events that may impact on the achievement of the climate change requirements. So a specific obligation there: if we're not going to achieve something or there's a risk we won't, let's notify the early warning, address it as soon as possible. And also we've brought in a clause on disclosure to allow for information relating to climate change to be used, disclosed and publicised to others for the purposes stated in the climate change requirements. The idea is to share good practice, to allow reporting information to be captured to help improve the knowledge within the industry. In terms of compensation events, acceleration, acceptance of defects, clauses have been added to allow the impact of these events to be reflected in the performance table in order to maintain its incentive. It may well be that due to a change in scope, an aspect of the performance table can't be achieved or can't be achieved by the date originally anticipated, so we need the ability to revise it to maintain it as this incentive for performance. We also have clauses requiring the contractor to report regularly on current and future achievement of the targets in the performance table, and where there's a potential they're going to fail to meet the targets, to propose corrective action for the project manager to hopefully agree to and to implement to put things back on track. And also we've introduced the ability for the contractor to submit proposals to try to reduce the impact of the asset on climate change, not just in its creation, but also in its future operation, maintenance and demolition. So encouraging the contractor to come up with good ideas. How can we reduce the impact of the asset being created, but not just in that construction phase, but also beyond that, with the contractor being rewarded, giving financial incentives in order to come up with those good ideas if the client is then going to take them forward. So X29, as with all NEC contracts, is designed for use with any types of work, services or supply anywhere in the world. It's an enabler, and that means it's going to need content being included in respect of things like the climate change requirements, the targets in the performance table. Inherently flexible, clients, contractors can include whatever they want in those documents, make them very specific to their location, their particular objectives, but it does need that content to be developed. And one of the key issues in the feedback we received was we need to put the flesh on the bones. We need to start giving some examples of content. We need to get consistent ways of measuring performance. And so that is something that we're looking to address. We're looking to engage with the industry, looking at good practice, best practice examples that we can start to gather together and share. And we're starting that process today. There's a workshop this afternoon on secondary option X29 where we're going to start hopefully working through what the contents of some of these documents could look like, sources of data we could use to start creating that baseline, those examples of good practice. But I think we recognise that it's hard to publish hard information on that because it's changing, it's moving, and that's why it's going to be through a guidance document process we'll address that. So in terms of the way forward, when we have X29 available, that will be a free download from the NEC website. So hopefully in the next days, or certainly by the end of this month, we'll have X29 available for those main and subcontracts as a free download. So keep an eye out for the NEC website to get access to that. It will be accompanied by supporting guidance notes. And what we'd very much welcome is you as the users to share feedback. You know, have we still got things we can improve upon? Are there still further tweaks or changes to be made? You know, NEC contracts continue to evolve, and this secondary option will be part of that. So please give your feedback, please get engaged, and please help share and capture best practice going forward that we can then share with the wider industry. And that's it from me.
Great, Ian, thank you. I mean, for me, is it amazing to see actually NEC is on the front foot in trying to help tackle sort of climate change head on, really, with the introduction of the secondary option. There is, to Ian's point, a workshop this afternoon. There are 2 different workshops which we'll get to, but yeah, if that's of interest to you, please go and attend that one. I'm conscious we are a little bit behind time. Rudy. So
thanks, John.
I will try my best to claw back what we can. Thanks to Ian for I guess, finishing a little bit abruptly for us there to help us do that. So this session now is going to be the Q&A session. So with you guys in the face-to-face audience here as well as online. We also hopefully will have Mark on screen if we can get him on. That would be helpful as well. And the Q&A will be with the panel members that we have here. Right, okay, no problems. We will carry on regardless, as always. Okay, so I'm going to go to an online question first. Let me just see whether this refreshes. No, it won't do, so I will leave that for a second. But is there anybody in the audience that has a question? We do have a couple of roving mics available. So we've got a question middle down there, and then one at the front as well. You just pop your hand back up, sir. Thank you. And then one at the front here. Can you just state your name and the organisation that you're from as well, please?
Yeah, Sean Kelly from Advantage RSK. A question for Ian. With regards to X29, Ian, in a similar fashion to what happened when the NEC4 was released, are NEC contracts that are looking for early adopters of X29 in order that they can report back experiences?
Yeah, I think the NEC is very keen to see people starting to adopt that clause, starting to use it. Very keen to see examples of the content being produced in respect of climate change requirements and the performance tables. So yeah, I think we're very keen to hear from anybody who would like to start to use it and to provide support around that.
Great, thanks for the question, Sean. Thank you, Ian. Okay, sir, your name and organisation?
Hi, Ben Wasner from Mott MacDonald. It's a general question, actually. Shai was mentioning in the playbook that some of the outcomes for focus was obviously sustainability, climate change, and also positive social outcomes. Is there going to be a secondary option then for social outcomes in the same vein as X29? I know that's obviously Mott MacDonald is quite keen on developing that area, so it's quite big. I'll pass it on.
Okay, that's all right.
Feel free, Richard.
Sorry.
Richard, do you want to just stand?
Yeah, sorry.
So the audience can
Sorry,
see as
Richard Patterson from Mott MacDonald. I've been a small part of helping Ian with X29 and others. It's a very good question, because the way the thing is drafted is effectively these two things. There's the climate change requirements, as Ian explained, and the performance table. And there's nothing to stop you putting whatever you bloody well like in the performance table. It doesn't have to be climate change things. So if you've got a specific social thing that you're trying to incentivise, have you use a certain number of apprentices, that sort of stuff. There's no reason at all why you couldn't build that into the performance table in the same way that you could have built it into X20 anyway. So it's going to be used, potentially be used for things wider than just climate change. Do you agree, Ian?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things there. So in terms of the concept of a performance table, that already exists in a number of NEC contracts already. It's in the alliance contracts, the DBOC contract, and probably more predominantly now in the FMC, the facilities management contract, subcontract. They have that performance table concept within them. So we already have this as a way of incentivising multiple things, not just climate change. In X29, that is specifically focused on climate change. It could be used for other things, but I would just sort of caution that people don't see it as a backdoor way of bringing in additional incentives or possible negative incentives for things beyond that. So whilst it can be used for that, I think people need to be very clear what the purpose is, if that's what they're going to use it for, and not try to leverage things in that maybe sit outside of what the intent is without making people aware of that.
Okay, thank you for that, Ian. Thank you, Richard, as well. I'm going to bring Mark in on that question. Mark, can you hear me okay?
I can. You might just need to repeat the question for me, if that's okay.
Of course I will do. I'm going to build on it because it's an online question as well. And the question specifically from the online forum is how much of an overlap is there between X29 performance table and potentially a social value objective or objectives that clients may include in their table. And just for some context, Ian was presenting about X29 secondary option and the specific addition of a performance table where clients can add in specific climate change performance requirements unique to their contract. So I guess to repeat the question is what potential conflict may be between that and social value outcomes in a tender?
Well, that's sort of quite a technical question. I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer that. I mean, I think what I would say, if I try and answer that in the context of HS2, I know I touched on this a little bit in the case study that we presented this morning. We have set out requirements for work around net zero, carbon reduction and the like in our works information. And we've also been not explicit but implicit around, and in fact we've seen sort of mixed levels of take up by a supply chain on driving sort of social value outcomes. So for us, those things sit complementary to one another. They can sit alongside each other, and we don't see that as a conflict. But I don't think you have explicitly taken the X29 clause into our contracts yet. I think they would have gone long before that's come into play. So Ian's probably better placed to sort of respond to going forward to the question: is there a potential conflict? We certainly haven't seen the way we've set our contracts up, those two things sitting at odds with each other.
Okay, Mark, that's really helpful. And my intention wasn't to put you on the spot on a technical nature, but you actually you've really built on what Ian and Richard have said. So thank you. We've probably got time for one more question, if there is any. Cheryl, just there. Thank you. What's your name and organisation, please?
Stuart Wright, Lincolnshire County Council. Mine's a very quick question, actually, just regarding option X29. You mentioned it's usable in all NEC4 types of contracts. Is it also usable within the NEC3 contracts?
Well, it's drafted specifically for NEC4 in terms of the terminology, in terms of the referencing within it. Whilst NEC3 continues to be supported by NEC, providing training, guidance and help to existing users, we're not currently updating that contract form. You know, we are encouraging users to move to NEC4. It wouldn't be too difficult to take it and to change the terminology, the referencing to suit NEC3, but the intent is just to publish it for NEC4, as I say, that is the contract that NEC is now updating. While we continue to support NEC3, it's not something we're looking to bring out new secondary options for.
It has been 5 years since it came out.
Yeah. Not quite like Microsoft or Apple, where you turn off the switch and no one supports it at all. We continue to support its use, very much so, but in terms of new developments, they're based upon NEC4.
Okay, thank you. Richard, did you have a question?
Just to one point, just to join the dots together, there was mention earlier from Mark about the importance of PAS 2080 and the new carbon publicly available specification, which I'm not an expert in at all, but I do believe the update is really focusing on measurement and targeting measurement for carbon. So at the one end of this X29 is the potential to put such targets in the contract for actual carbon use. But I would remind everybody that we can use it just simply to encourage better whole life cost of products, of things developed by a designer, by including performance targets that relate to the whole life cost of the thing. So if you've got a thing which has a power consumption, for example, which the client's going to be left with for 20 years, you can include that performance target for power consumption as part of your tender. Now, we could have done that with X17, but we can now do that within this new X29 as well. So that's a sort of simpler use of X29 than going into the micro detail of carbon measurement.
Yeah, that's a really valid point, isn't it? I think we've seen X17 used historically in the past. Performance damages helps consider the approach to a whole life cost.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yes. So X29 builds on that, so thank you. We've just got time for one more. I know I've repeated myself a little bit there, but feel free.
Hi, hello. Valerie Checks Overseeing Project. I'd probably ask a question on X29 as well. So I've reviewed the clause, the consultation version available, and I was a bit frustrated to see that collaboration was the shortest part of it. So, and I think just looking at what you've presented, Ian, I still think that there is a lot of pressure on the contractor to fulfill obligations. How this can be addressed, because I understand there is a lot of flexibility. For example, you give a chance of submitting contractor's plan as part 2 in contract, or you can address that after the contract sign off. Does this not leave too much room for additional pressure on the contractor's side? Thank you.
Okay, so in terms of the collaboration point, obviously we still have X12, multi-party collaboration. That in itself allows for there to be shared targets, shared incentives for multiple suppliers, contractors, consultants to work together. And so there's nothing stopping X29 being used with that. As with X17, as with X20, we need to be careful we don't have overlapping KPI targets. They need to be fitted together. There will be some guidance provided around that. So that is one way you could have a more structured way of incentivizing multiple parties to work together. I think the idea really with the pressure on the supply chain is to try to avoid that through the guidance, etc. But ultimately it's going to be down to how the clients put this together and how then contractors engage their subcontractors using it. So we'll try and provide that support and guidance on how we think it should be dealt with, then obviously looking to the industry to adopt it in that manner.
And the message from the playbook is that you should not put it in the contract and then figure it out as you go along, but spend enough time as necessary and stress test it before you get people committed to it, so that you should not have those issues later.
And then another follow-up question on this one as well. Do you think, given the importance of the subject, would that clause become a main clause of the contract at some point?
Potentially so. I mean, we have in different iterations of the contract moved what were secondary options into core clauses, moved what were core clauses into secondary options as they've evolved, as they've progressed. And so certainly I think, aspects of it, if not all of it, may eventually come into the core clauses. As I say, things like the performance table is already part of the core clauses in the FMC contract. So there are some precedents for that approach. So yeah, that will be something that will be considered depending on how widely it's adopted, how people respond to its use, and it will be a consideration going forward.
Okay, great. Thank you, Ian. Thank you, panel. Mark, thank you for dialing in. I appreciate your time, and thank you for your presentation earlier. It was received really well. That brings us to the end of our first sort of Q&A session now, and the first part of our morning session as well. So we're going to go back up to this meeting room for teas and coffees. Please do visit our sponsors. They make this event possible for us. Spend some time talking to them. Spend some time networking. We're going to head back down here for 11 o'clock, ready for our next set of speakers. So I will see you then.